heartened to hear that some of the issues that we constantly grapple with and try and find a solution and try and find a way to get them right are some of the issues which Colette has been highlighting. And I'm very glad to hear that a lot of the things that you said are sort of resonate with us and resonate with the challenges we think we face and the challenges we think all of us are likely to face going forward in not just a digital marketplace, but more so what I would try and say is a digital society we're sort of heading towards. So it's good that we should be debating these issues, because if you think back 10 years ago, which is when I used to live in Boston, and I remember getting myself an internet account and not quite knowing what to do with it, because I was told it was good to be able to use so that you can see magazines online, and I couldn't quite understand why I would want to see a magazine online since I already have a copy in my house. And it didn't have too many friends who had email at that point in time. At that point in time, the internet was for geeks, or the early adopters, as we like to call them. And at that time, there were about, I'd say, 57,000 people in broadband 10 years ago, and 70 million people connected to the internet. If you play that movie forward, as of the end of last year, there are 1.4 billion people connected to the internet around the world, and about 400 million people connected via broadband. So clearly, this is no longer an early adopter phenomena or a phenomena for people who have technology affiliations. This is a phenomena which is pretty mainstream, and it is appropriate for us to be debating these issues and trying to understand how do we continue the march towards 6 billion or 7 billion and make sure that we don't have issues like social inclusion or issues like people not having access to the various kinds of technologies and opportunities this begins to offer. In that context, the way I like to think about it is this is almost like 1.4 billion people who live in a new country, because a lot of these people have a very similar set of characteristics. If you think about what's happening on the internet now, or this digital society, people are beginning to maintain their identity. People go on Facebook, people go on MySpace, they go on LinkedIn. They're beginning to manage their identities. It is now people like to have their own email address with their real names. And I remember, 8 or 10 years ago, we would just want to have an email ID just so that we can see what's going on. But now we're beginning to maintain our identity on this net. We are beginning to show similar characteristics. We're beginning to collaborate. We're beginning to form communities. And not only that, we're beginning to have similar expectations from businesses that we interact with on the web. So you're beginning to see a whole set of characteristics that the digital society is beginning to take on. And it's important for us to understand the implications of this. It is important for us to play this movie forward and then come back and say, how do we need to shape these things from a regulatory perspective or from a policy perspective so that we can get towards more desirable outcomes in the longer term, as opposed to make some early mistakes, which could end up in the wrong place. If you take a look at how this society is beginning to impact different parts of business, without wanting to sound like this is too big a deal, but I actually think this is almost like the next revolution that is happening in our lives, because it is going to change almost everything that happens around us. And the way I like to describe it is, I think we are the transition generation, all of us in this room, because my daughter, who's 11, does not understand why things have to be programmed and watched on television in sequential order. She thinks everything should be available at any time she wants. She walks up to me, asks me questions, and says, "Dad, why does an octopus have 8 legs and October is the 10th month?" And when her father cannot answer, she figures that Google or Wikipedia are more likely to give her a better answer than her dad. So you can already see the new generation is trying to figure out how to get all these things answered without having to rely on their parents. So this is going to reshape how we live, or how the next generations live. We're the few people who remember what life was without it and what life is with it. But if you go back and say, do you remember a world without electricity? We would have to relearn how to live if suddenly we didn't have electricity for a few years. Or even more recently, I think we'd have to relearn how to live if we didn't have mobile phones, and maybe in a few years, digital cameras. So this is what's going to happen, I think, with the internet. In 10, 15, 20 years from now, people will find it hard to imagine a world without the internet or without this digital society. And what we do now is going to shape how that looks like 20 years from now. So it's very important. It's very hard to see the revolution happening when you're sort of in the midst of it, except if you step back. I moved to the UK 9 years ago, and I moved from the United States. I had VCRs, which I had recently bought, and I didn't want to replace them, so I plugged one in the UK. purely due to my stupidity, it blew up in my face, almost, not realizing there's slightly different standards in different parts of the world. So I decided to get myself a new one. And when I went to the shop, the educated and probably, pre-signed gentleman said, don't bother buying a VCR, buy a DVD player, which I did. Except when I went to my local video store, there was a small rack of DVDs which I could buy, which are all the classics, because they figured out the only thing which will sustain in the long term would be classics, because it's very hard to have a DVD and a tape for new movies. So I was sort of relegated to watching classics on my DVD player. I couldn't get a new movie. 9 years later, when I walk into that store, I can't find a tape. I don't know where all the VCRs have gone. And if 9 years ago somebody had told me that in 8 or 9 years VCRs won't exist, I'm pretty sure a lot of people would have said that's ridiculous, that's unlikely to happen. So it's very important that if you think about that, if you think about what people are doing on the internet, and I think there is the seamstress Phyllis, and there is the gentleman wanting to read the Swedish newspaper, and it is impacting everything that we do. If you look at the world of commerce, in 2008, $440 billion of e-commerce was conducted on the web. About 150 billion of that was in Europe. That's a good number, and it's $150 billion of goods and services exchanged on the internet. But even more so, what's important is over 70% of the transactions are actually influenced by the web. It's very rare now that people or consumers will go buy a big ticket item without spending time on the internet and doing the research, and which is actually changing the way things are sold. I remember talking to an electronics retailer in the UK. And I said, how's business? He said, business is okay, but this internet thing is a bit of a problem. And I said, why is it a problem? He said, well, earlier, if you came to buy a TV from me, I had really smart salespeople, and they'll tell you, this is one TV, this is the other TV, this is the third TV. And the real clincher was when the consumer said, which one should I get? The guy would usually say, oh, they're all three good, but I actually have the one on the left. And that'll be the deal, because if the guy who knows everything about TVs is buying the one on the left, that must be the best option, and that would make the sale. He said, now people show up with sheafs of paper printed out from the internet, and they want to know the difference between aspect ratios and pixel ratios and where the AV plug is. So the consumer is way more informed. And that is changing the way. So I said, so how are you solving this problem? He says, well, I've got to send all my salespeople to internet training. So again, it is changing the way that commerce is conducted in today's world, and it is going to continue to change the way commerce is conducted in the future. If you look at the world of information, I gave you the example of my 11-year-old. She believes that it's much easier to go find information on the internet. I grew up in India. I studied engineering. I could not get access to books which were printed in the United States or the UK because I couldn't afford a trip to the British Library every week, but I'd want to read the book. Today, with the benefit of the internet, with the benefit of digitization, there are consumers around the world who are able to access information which is far more easily available than it used to be available at that point in time. And I think this is going to become more and more the case. What we're going to see is we're going to see a lot of people having to bring information and make it available digitally around the world. If you take the world of communication, I told you the notion of mine not knowing what to do with email 10 years ago. Now I don't know what to do without email. On last count, there are about 1.3 billion email addresses that people have. On last count, over 200 billion email messages are sent every day. Skype accounts for 8% of the international voice traffic. 18 million users update their statuses daily on Facebook, telling their friends what they're doing. So clearly the way we are communicating with each other is beginning to change. Colette gave the example of how the motivation of a lot of people in the UK is that they can communicate with relatives far away. And actually it doesn't matter how you get hooked onto the internet, because once you get hooked onto something, you start using it and discovering the other uses that it has. So there'll be very, very many different things that people will do, and whether content is king or services are king or different things that we do are king, in the end, it is the end consumer who's actually going to use all these services, and it's their ability to discover them, their ability to learn about these, their ability to be educated about these, and us making sure that everything that they need is available for them is going to be important. If you take the world, if you take the world of entertainment, I think the biggest change that is going to happen in my lifetime is going to be the way entertainment is created and consumed. We're seeing what's happening in the music industry, and I understand some of the issues around it. But I think the next big revolution that's going to happen is it's going to be happening in the television business. Because as I said, my daughter does not understand why she has to wait on Friday evening at 9 o'clock to watch something which might be past her bedtime, or why she has to be at home on Saturday afternoon when something's playing on television when she'd rather be out playing tennis. So we are going to go to a world which is sort of a more of an instant gratification world where things are going to be available when you need them and where you need them. There are various examples of, there's this Portuguese girl who studied in the UK, who's a music fan, and she decided to start recording songs and putting them on YouTube. And she did that, and she went back to Portugal, and she kept doing that for about 30 days. And she started developing a following until a point in time where over 500,000 people from around the world were beginning to log in to listen to her every morning when she had recorded something. Well, thankfully for her, as well as the music industry, I think it was RC or Columbia, one of them decided to sign her up for £1 million. And she's now the new budding artist. And the reason I'm telling you this story is not because there's always a case you can find, but actually it is an insight into how the dynamics of the entire artist discovery, talent discovery process is going to change the music industry and the television industry. So there's a tremendous amount of change that is likely to happen in the entertainment business as well. Take the case of newspapers. It was hard for us to get a Swedish newspaper on time or an Indian newspaper for me if I was in the UK. And we're going to see a lot of disaggregation of content happen as this begins to be used as a platform for publishing and gathering news, as it already is. So if you look at all these changes that are happening in front of us, these are going to have significant amount of impacts on businesses as well as significant amount of impacts on consumers. If you think, the first thing which I see from my perspective, the best way to think about the internet is actually, it is the world's largest information, communication, and distribution network. That's what it is. It is going to change the rules of communication, to change the rules of distribution, and to change the rules of the way we access information. And if you believe that, any business that is involved, where distribution is involved, is going to change. There are examples of this guy, John Murray Wells, who's in the UK again, who started a company called Glasses Direct. He couldn't find prescription glasses cheaply. He decided he wanted to start a business from his father's extra bedroom. And today he's the largest he's the largest prescription retailer, prescription glasses retailer in the UK. Because he offered these things for $29.99. And people decided that he was offering good service, and he was able to build a business on the back of that because he eliminated the entire cost of distribution, and he turned it into an on-demand business. He ordered, he went and ordered, and he delivered it to you. So it is going to change the way we actually look at distribution in the business world. It is, there's a whole different power that is going to get created in terms of the power of collaboration. Consumers are beginning to collaborate. I think that the most recent example is the example of the election in the United States. There were people, there's a website called MyBO, My Barack Obama, where 25% of the people who voted for him in the election were connected by using Facebook communities. So people could go up there, be part of a community, and they could choose to donate, they could choose to get together on a certain set of issues, and the amount of collaboration that it created was phenomenal, and people felt they were engaged. I mean, to Colette's point earlier, there is tremendous amounts of participation that's going on from a societal perspective, and they are going to participate in the processes of forming opinions. On a much closer note, at Google, we were able to take a bunch of data, and in the US, we've taken the data, and we have been able to analyze the searches around flu. And based on the searches on flu in different parts of the US, we're actually now able to create a predictive model for flu outbreaks before they happen, which is much quicker than the way the government agencies can collect the data, report it, get it all from all the doctors, and predict and figure out what to do with it. So there's another sort of positive opportunity here, which is a positive opportunity of the power of data. You can actually take tremendous amounts of data and reuse it to provide much better services for the consumer or much better services for society. I mean, the other one, which is because, whilst people think we're in the advertising business, we think we're in the technology business. The other fascinating sort of development that is going to happen with all this data for us is we think that the whole concept of translation is going to get enhanced by this. So traditionally, translation has been sort of dictionary translation. You take a word, you look at what it means, and you translate it. Now with the fact that we can actually find tens of millions of books which are digitized, we actually are able to compare sentences. So if you look at a sentence and it's translated 40 times the same way, we believe that this must be the translation for the sentence. So it becomes more sort of easy to translate as opposed to look at it on a word-by-word basis, which usually results in which has very, very strange results. So again, there's this tremendous power of data that can be used as this begins to happen. So if all this is going to happen, the question which I often get asked is, well, how are we going to pay for all this stuff on the internet? You know, how are all these businesses in content and entertainment going to make money? And you know, people get surprised, well, there's so much online advertising going on, there's so much money being created in advertising. I don't think it's any different than the way we've been monetizing content for the last 50 years. You know, for the last 50 years, the way it works is you create content, and either you charge a price for it, and you get paid a subscription, or you advertise against it, and people pay for it by advertising. I have free newspapers in the UK. I can pick up on the tube, I can read and leave it there, and they're fully funded by advertising. And then I have newspapers where I have to pay a subscription, and I have journals where I pay a subscription, and there's no advertising in it. So there's a huge sort of a spectrum of how these things get paid for. And interestingly, a lot of the internet is paid for by advertising. And you know, whilst Colette talked about internet advertising, and I wrote down the words she said. She said it is about transparency, and I totally agree, it is about transparency. She said it's about informed consent, consumers should be able to opt out, and I agree, consumers should be able to opt out. It is about their ability to change their mind, and it is about their ability to change their mind. It is about effective processes, and not advertising against sensitive areas. And we fully subscribe to that notion. This is the way that we need to make sure that we are able to advertise to consumers, and also make sure it's relevant, which is what he said. Because, you know, fascinatingly enough, if you can get advertising as close to information, it ceases to be advertising. And the best way to illustrate this is if you and I are walking in a desert and we're really thirsty and you see a big sign saying water here, I'd consider that information as opposed to advertising, even if it had Evian or Volvic at the bottom of it. But if I see another one 50 yards later, then I'm actually going to probably get bothered by it and deem it as advertising. So the question is, how can you understand the preferences of consumers and be able to give them advertising which becomes closer and closer to information, which is probably going to be one major way that we are going to be able to pay for all the content as well as the creativity that we need to continue to maintain as we transition to the internet. If you think about these issues from a regulatory perspective, you know, there's a lot of conversation, and I think there is a need for a holistic look at some of these issues as opposed to looking at them in a silo, because when you look at them in silos, a change here makes a big impact somewhere else, and which you are unable to anticipate. And I just want to make sure that we don't risk the development of this digital society when we look at it individually. So if you think about the notion of, you know, we touched upon the notion of advertising and interest-based advertising, but if you think about the conversations on privacy, I think it boils down to something the commissioner has said in her speech, and I was able to look at it. It's the notion of trust. You know, if you can find a way that there is transparency and trust, this thing's going to evolve. I remember many years ago getting a credit card. And once I have a credit card, it is so convenient that I don't carry money when I travel around 30, 40 countries around the world constantly. I prefer using my credit card. Well, I'm pretty sure if somebody wanted in my credit card company, they would know exactly what I ate, when my birthday was, when my wife's birthday is, how old my child is, what I buy at the grocery store, how many people I had dinner with, and where I like to eat. All these things are easily deductible, and where I like to stay. These things are easily deductible from all the information about me from my credit card company. But the reason I choose to use it and continue to use it because I trust they will not abuse the data. I also choose to use it because it gives me convenience. So I've made a conscious choice as a consumer that somewhere there's tremendous amounts of convenience, and as long as I can trust the provider of that data. And I think the same principles will apply on the internet over time. It is just that we don't have enough experience with enough providers on the internet. And people who want to create sustainable longer-term businesses are going to have to follow those principles of making sure that they can be trusted with consumers' data. If you take the issue of copyright, I gave you the example of the book which I could not read when I lived in India because it was in the British Library. And I had to wait every morning. When it was a physics book, the Feynman lectures, I had to go to the library every morning, and my co-student who'd borrowed it had decided not to return it for the semester. So we'd all go there, and we'd wait for it, and he wouldn't return it. So we had no choice. We didn't have access to the book. But if I remember, the librarian would go look through the index cards, flip them, and say, go to aisle number 3, turn right, it should be in the 3rd section. And you'd go back and say, it's not in the 3rd section. And we couldn't quite tell if it was misfiled, it didn't exist. And I wasn't even sure that was the book I actually needed, or was there another book? Now, today's technology actually allows you to very cheaply digitize the entire book and index it digitally. And then I can see a snippet of that book and understand if that's the book I want or not. But today's copyright laws do not allow me to do that because they were not created for the digital world. So the question is, how do we take a look at existing regulation and see whether it is going to go forward and enable this digital society, and what changes do we need to make to some of these issues? The other issue is the issue of openness. I think one of the things we need to continue to drive this internet society or this digital society is we need interoperability and openness. We need things to be based on open source, open codes. I'm surprised that today instant messengers don't talk to each other. This is like saying the telephone network of one operator should not talk to the other operator because I want to protect it. I mean, imagine if our mobile phones stopped working and we would have to know which mobile phone operator the other person is on before we were able to talk to them, or we're not able to talk to them. So there are some things we need to do in terms of creating openness and interoperability to drive this continuous sort of evolution of the digital society. So from my perspective, there's lots of tremendous amounts of opportunities that this offers us, and there are tremendous amounts of challenges. And the question really is, can we make sure that we think through these, find the right solution in the interest of the consumer, and making sure we don't create more barriers on the way. And I think we're fully signed up to do something like that. Well, thank you very much for listening.